The ace lawyer has been a part of the American cultural lexicon for the better part of a century, recently re-emerging as a gritty HBO 1930s period piece that stayed faithful to the novels that inspired it. From the page to the screen, here's a look into the curious case of Perry Mason. Despite dropping out of law school, Earl Stanley Gardner passed the California State Bar exam and started working as an attorney in 1911. He specialized in representing underdogs, particularly immigrant laborers from Mexico and China, and spent hours in law libraries each night after arguing cases all day, looking for obscure statutes that he could unleash in court at the perfect moment. That would become a signature move of his literary creation, Perry Mason, when in the 1920s, Gardner adopted a side hustle of writing legal thrillers. At first, Gardner planned to pen novels about a series of different attorneys, but on the advice of a publisher, he opted to focus solely on Mason's adventures. The character debuted in the 1933 novel The Case of the Velvet Claws, a bestseller and the first of around 80 Perry Mason mysteries that Gardner would pen through 1969. The public liked Gardner's entertaining and purportedly accurate courtroom dramas, and he obliged. He referred to himself as the Fiction Factory, and at one point employed 6 secretaries to type out the manuscripts he dictated into a tape recorder. After he passed away in 1970, the New York Times called Gardner the best-selling American author of the century, on account of how he'd moved 170 million copies of his Perry Mason books in the US alone. The Perry Mason franchise is most famous for its iterations as a television show. The intense courtroom series starring Raymond Burr from the 1950s and 1960s, and the moody 1930s set reimagining with Matthew Rhys had debuted on HBO in 2020. But long before Earl Stanley Gardner's popular books about Perry Mason were adapted for the small screen, they were successfully converted into other media formats. In 1934, just a year after the first Perry Mason novel delighted readers, the first Perry Mason movie, The Case of the Howling Dog, was released. Within 3 years' time, Warner Brothers would release a total of 6 Perry Mason movies based on Gardner's stories, 4 of them starring Warren William as the world's greatest attorney.
How did you know I went there?
It's my business to know things. Give me the details.
The Perry Mason radio program, a 15-minute serial that ran 5 afternoons a week from 1943 to 1955 on CBS Radio, more closely resembled Gardner's crime and action-filled novels, as opposed to the somber, courtroom-dominated TV series. The radio show was popular enough that in 1956, CBS Radio tried to move it, format intact, to CBS television. But Gardner said no, leading the network to adapt it into the long-running daytime drama The Edge of Night. The original Perry Mason TV series ran from 1957 to 1966, and as a full season of a show back then ran around 30 episodes, a whopping 271 installments were produced. That provided syndicators with a huge volume of content to rerun on local stations hundreds of times over the ensuing 50-odd years. Perry Mason wasn't a serialized show. Each episode generally focused on a single case, wrapped up within the self-contained story, so even dedicated fans probably wouldn't notice that the rerun package was 1 episode short for years. The Oliver Twist-inspired February 1966 installment, The Case of the Twice-Told Twist, is otherwise a run-of-the-mill episode, except for the fact that it was produced in full color, the only episode in the original series run not presented in black and white.
And now we see you for what you really are.
As color took hold of TV by the mid-60s, Twice Told Twist was a test to see how Mason would look if it were renewed for a 10th season. But it wasn't meant to be. Star Raymond Burr told the Washington Post in 1986, "When we got to the end of 9, they asked me for 1 more year in color, and they shot 1 show in color, and I said no." With no 10th season, there were no more color episodes of Perry Mason, at least not this version of the series anyway. Perry Mason was so good at arguing his case in front of a judge and jury that, unlike a real-life attorney, his win-loss ratio leans staggeringly in favor of the former, 268 wins and 3 losses. After all, he was a good guy in the title character, and in the relatively quaint world of early television, it would have been unthinkable for him to actually lose a case. In order to balance shocking twists with his winning record, show writers sometimes use some courtroom maneuvering to give the lawyer technical victories after the fact. The 1963 episode, The Case of the Deadly Verdict, begins with a confused Mason receiving a guilty verdict and a death sentence for his client, accused of murder. But then he investigates and finds a real killer. His loss turns into another win. In 1958's The Case of the Terrified Typist, Mason's defendant is found guilty, but is later revealed to be a trickster pretending to be the real bad guy.
Your Honor, this is just another wild-eyed, dramatic grandstand play for which counsel is so noted.
Mason's only actual loss came in 1963's The Case of the Witless Witness, an episode that begins with the attorney losing an appeal, a rare but relatively minor loss for the improbably capable attorney. By the early 1970s, nostalgia for decades very recently gone by was in full swing. Fans of 50s culture helped turn Grease into a Broadway smash and make American Graffiti a blockbuster movie. On TV, shows starring old favorites and revivals of classics filled network schedules. Everything old was new again. In 1973 alone, CBS programs The New Bill Cosby Show, The New Dick Van Dyke Show, and The New Perry Mason. The original Perry Mason show had only been off the air for 7 years at that point, and none of the original cast returned for the reboot. Instead of bringing back Raymond Burr, producers hired lesser-known actor Monty Markham to take over for Burr in the iconic role of Perry Mason. CBS was apparently so confident in the project that, according to Markham, they bypassed the pilot and ordered it straight to series, asking for 26 episodes. But only 15 installments aired before CBS cancelled The New Perry Mason, which finished the season with low ratings in 1974. Out of 80 shows, the new take on an old favorite reportedly ranked in at number 71. Despite the failure of The New Perry Mason on CBS, the undefeatable attorney returned to television a mere 11 years later. This time, it was on NBC and in a different format, a succession of semi-regular made-for-TV movies, this time bringing back the biggest names from the original, the ones who were still alive at least. Raymond Burr returned as Perry Mason, and so did Barbara Hale as Secretary Della Street. The role of investigator Paul Drake, played by the deceased William Hopper, was reworked as Paul Drake Jr., and Hale's real-life son, William Katz, took the part. Perry Mason showed up on TV 3 or 4 times a season for a 2-hour time slot in these formulaic Matlock-esque films, in which a crime was investigated and then tried in intense courtroom scenes. A total of 26 Perry Mason movies aired between 1985 and 1993. Perry Mason, The Case of the Killer Kiss was the last project Burr would star in, with the movie airing 2 months after his death. The made-for-TV Mason movies were so reliable for NBC that the network kept the franchise going for 2 years after Burr's passing. In 4 movies with the umbrella title A Perry Mason Mystery, the character Perry Mason is said to be out of town, and memorable lawyers Anthony Caruso, played by Paul Sorvino, and Wild Bill McKenzie, played by Hal Holbrook, argue some very Perry Mason-esque cases in his absence. The Perry Mason character more or less died when Raymond Burr did in 1993, but in 2011, plans began in earnest to revive the crackerjack attorney and his cast of characters for a feature film, starring one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Robert Downey Jr. and his wife, producer Susan Downey, set the project up at Warner Brothers, with the Iron Man actor also serving as the lead actor and co-writer. The script was to be based on a brand new Perry Mason story set in the dark and seedy Los Angeles of Gardner's novels, but he wrote with production associate David Gambino. The movie never got off the ground, but in 2016, the project shifted to HBO, where execs were eager to make a new Perry Mason show and hired True Detective creator Nick Pizzolatto to write the episodes. A year later, however, Pizzolatto had dropped out in favor of a 3rd season of True Detective, and HBO brought in Weeds and Friday Night Lights writers Roland Jones and Ron Fitzgerald. The series was further delayed when Downey decided to serve only as an executive producer on Perry Mason and not act in it, opening the door for the Emmy-winning star of The Americans, Matthew Rhys. Finally, in March 2019, HBO officially ordered a Mason miniseries.
You've done such a great job on this Perry Mason series.
When Matthew Rhys got the offer to play Perry Mason, he was initially skeptical. He recalled in an interview with Collider, "I got this message saying, they want to talk to you about a remake of Perry Mason. And I was like, why would you want to remake Perry Mason? You can't remake Perry Mason."
I don't know if that's a good idea.
When Rhys received the full context of the offer from his agent, that it was an HBO reimagining of Perry Mason, his interest peaked. He said, "At the pitch meeting with the producers and writers, I realized very quickly that it wasn't a remake. It's a firm reimagining and a redefining of Perry Mason in a very interesting way." Then when production got moving along, Rhys realized his initial aversion to stepping into the shoes of a classic character was even more misguided, because upon reflection, he realized that he had few concrete, preconceived notions of the show and its main character. He told NPR, I, for one, had this image of who Perry Mason was, and then you have these vague memories of people confessing on the stand, but I had no real specifics of Perry Mason. Nevertheless, Rhys became interested in the role, finding it to be, quote, a very dark Perry Mason to which I was instantly attracted. He's also not nearly as experienced in his role as an attorney, providing an opportunity to see the early days of a fictional icon. Much in the same way the movie Casino Royale showed a version of secret agent James Bond before he was, James Bond.
You may have heard I'm new to this.
Objection. Sustained.
See what I mean?
The Perry Mason of HBO's 2020 reimagining is nothing like the Perry Mason of days past. Not yet an established criminal defense attorney, the Mason portrayed by Matthew Rhys is more like the one from Gardner's novels, a broke, bitter private detective, complicated and burdened, still suffering from PTSD years after fighting in World War I, haunted by a divorce and self-medicating with alcohol.
You look terrible. Are you drunk?
Probably.
Jesus, Perry.
Despite putting all of its significant resources into producing and promoting its Perry Mason origin series, HBO apparently didn't have exceptionally high expectations for how the series would perform. According to Entertainment Weekly, the network initially billed the program as a one-off miniseries. That way, if it failed to attract viewers over the course of its 8 episodes, the network could limit the perception of failure. But all of that trepidation was for naught. The series' premiere episode in June 2020 attracted 1.7 million viewers, the cable service's biggest debut in 2 years, outdrawing recent hits like The Outsider and Watchmen. Within a month, Perry Mason had an audience of 8 million, leading HBO to reclassify the show and then renew it for season 2. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite movies and TV shows are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.